Hey everybody, this is Kevin Steinhauser from Fiveable, and today we're going to be talking about embedding quotes in our writing with a specific look at rhetorical analysis writing. So embedding quotes is going to be really important, really in all facets of writing in which you do use quotes. So in college, it's going to be research papers. For our class this year, AP Lang and Comp, that's going to be rhetorical analysis and synthesis. So it's actually a really important writing skill that we're going to work on a little bit together today, but something to practice as you are using quotes in your classes, the day-to-day writing that you're doing. It doesn't have to just be AP Lang and Comp in which you are using the skills that we talk about today. The more that you practice strong writing techniques, the more naturally they're going to come. On the AP exam this year, you do not have time, honestly, to really think about how am I effectively crafting my sentences and my writing. Instead, I want that to become a skill that you become better and better at, and it becomes more and more natural. Let's see. It says the audio is not working. Talk about. Today we're going to talk about using effective quotes in terms of not using the author every single thing that they're saying, like not quoting an entire sentence. However, working for simply getting to the core of their sentence. So again, every single time that you practice writing, I want you to be thinking about writing style. And that's our point today. So I'm going to launch into my PowerPoint, but please do keep me posted if we have anything on our end that we can fix in terms of audio. So this is all in our rhetorical analysis unit. We started with reading with an analytical mind. We walked through to write like a college student, you have to think like a college student. With all of that said, we want to make sure that every single thing we're doing, and then we're moving on from rhetorical analysis this year, we are reading and thinking like a college student. In other words, we're thinking and reading with the rhetorical triangle and all the things that we've been working on the past 5 weeks, keeping all of that in mind as we move forward into argumentation. All right, we took a whole hour to work on identifying the overall purpose. So when you're looking at an analytical text, remember, you must look at the overall purpose. If you don't know what the purpose is, right? So that's what we talked about there. And then probably the most underrated step is step 3, identifying what is worth talking about. So it's not a matching game. That's what I talked about a couple weeks back. It's what is the most important and impactful thing or strategy or choice that the writer is making that is worth actually talking about or writing about. And then the last couple of weeks we talked about practically what does an effective introduction paragraph look like? What does it consist of? What does an effective body paragraph look like? What does it consist of? If you have not seen those 2 live sessions, please go back and check them out on the replay because they are certainly worth your time, really making sure we're hitting the right components. I'm going to take a quick break to check back in, see if we're having audio issues today. All right, it looks like we're going to be all right. So let's keep going when it comes to, there we go. Today, we're looking forward to embedding quotes. So this is a picture I just grabbed offline, but this is the metaphor I kind of talked about very briefly last week. So let's go a little bit more in detail today. The cake, like the majority of where your score is coming from for rhetorical analysis is your analytical thought. So that's why I spent 5 weeks really talking about that. All 5 of these are what are your analytical thoughts and how do you get them from your mind to the paper. So clearly that's the cake. You can't, as nice as this would be, you can't just have icing. Maybe on our cheat days we're allowed to do that, but in terms of your score, writing style is not going to get you very far alone, right? You have to bake your cake, and then the icing on the cake is literally what we're going to talk about today, your writing style. So honestly, if you're not at the point, as a writer, if you're not getting 5s and 6s, kind of in that range, 5, 6s, and 7s on your timed essays, this is not the most important live session that we've done in rhetorical analysis. I saved it for last for a reason. However, if you want to keep getting better, this is something to certainly keep in mind. Writing style is the icing on the cake, and it's impossible to get a 9 without being an effective writer, right? Of course, we're talking the 1 to 9 scale that our analytical essays are scored, that all AP essays are scored on for our class. All right, so let's take a moment to talk about the components of effective writing. We're only going to talk about embedding quotes today, but really whenever your teacher or whenever I just throw out and say, hey, effective writing, this is really what we're looking for. So one, you're actually just using the rules of spelling, grammar, capitalization, etc. that you know. It's called English conventions. You're just writing and phrasing things the right way, grammatically. Second, precise language. Notice I didn't say fancy, fluffy language. Precise language means you are actually using the best, most specific word for the context. So it's not a word, you're not impressing your AP reader if you use a word that you've never used in your life before. Like, I saved this word, I had it in my toolkit, and I pulled it out on the essay. All of that's fine. You want to have an extensive vocabulary. But real writers, like the real advanced writers, use their toolkit of words and they pull out the most precise words that prove their point. Not the longest words, or not the archaic words, or not words that you actually never use. That's not the point. Not words, certainly, like try to outthink your AP reader, like a word that hopefully they haven't heard of, right? I've talked to students who actually thought that was the goal. Like, if I use words that my AP reader has never heard of, maybe that'll be impressive. I've actually talked to a student that said that. That is not the point at all. It is very clear to us as AP readers, just people who have read thousands and thousands of essays, if you are in control of your language or not. And oftentimes, when you try to pull out the most impressive word, it's just hard to do if you're not used to it, right? If it's not a word you often use, it becomes often clear that you're not in control of the writing anymore. You're letting the vocabulary kind of control you. What I mean by that is just use the language that you would use in an academic writing to prove very, very clearly your point. So you've got to be in control of your vocabulary. Please don't use words that are like not helping you actually make your point. All right, and then third, varied sentence structure. I'm not going to take, again, much time talking about 1, 2, and 3 today, but varied sentence structure simply means, are you starting your sentences differently? Maybe prepositional phrases, dependent clauses, etc. You just want to make sure your paper is not reading super short, choppy sentences. You want to make sure you're actually just using advanced writing. Now, the best writers, which we're not going to talk about today with number 3, but use varied sentence structure deliberately. The best writers don't use a dependent clause, and by that I mean like a statement like, while blah, blah, blah is true, comma, blah, blah, blah. However that works, like the independent clause is the core of the sentence. The dependent clause is something that is not complete. So while x, comma, y is something that I recommend my students do a lot, but you're not doing it just to check a box and say, I'm using a dependent clause. I'm starting my sentence in a different way. The best writers, the most thoughtful writers, start off with while x, or whatever the dependent clause is, because they want to put emphasis on the independent clause. So the best writers have a purpose for the way that they're not just using words, the words that they're using, but the way that they're structuring those words. All things to think about as we're talking about effective writing. But we're going to spend the rest of our time today talking about effectively embedding quotes. So let's launch in to that. Really quickly, let's just make sure all 4 of these are about effective writing. I'm not going to talk about effectively embedding quotes because that's the rest of the PowerPoint. But I do want to make sure we take a moment here to note, you are graded holistically in all 3 essays for AP Lang and Comp. It is different than a lot of AP classes where you have to do certain things to get certain points. Here, you have a prompt, you answer it to the best of your ability, and you get a score from 1 to 9. Our goal is at least a 6. That's my goal for everybody. But if you want to shoot for that 5, you got to get higher than 6s. So we're shooting for 7s, 8s, and 9s. Just depending on where you're at, you want to keep making improvement. It is very rare to get a 9. In fact, most students never in their lifetimes write a 9 in a 40-minute time constraint setting. It is super difficult. On average, when I go down to do the AP reading, I grade, let's say for every 1,000 essays that I grade, I find like 5 or 6 9s. Like, so it's very rare. With all of that said, advanced writing style is needed to get those scores of 7, 8, and 9. So the 9s are going to be beautiful and deliberate and doing all things that effective writers do, like I talked about. Going back to my cake metaphor, you got to bake your cake. That cake can get you to that 6, 7 range if it's really thorough and really awesome. But writing style is very impactful when we want to get those upper scores. Simply put, to score like a college student, you must write like a college student. All right, now let's launch into embedding quotes. Embedding quotes ensures you are the writer. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about all 3 of these real quick. Second, opens up space to analyze more fully. And third is just an all-around higher level writing technique. So let's actually start from the bottom and work our way back up. Why I say it's a higher level writing technique, when you actually read other people's writing, it is rare when they're embedding quotes for them to quote more than not even a whole sentence. So that's what we're going to practice today. Less is more in terms of what you are choosing to quote in rhetorical analysis. It's just a higher level writing technique. What I want to go to is actually number 2 is actually helping you with the cake, because you're opening up space to analyze more fully. So you're icing your cake with this big, beautiful writing style, and embedding quotes is part of that. But actually, by embedding quotes, you're saving time. Because if you go back to my cake metaphor, that cake that I showed you, 90-some% of it is the cake, and 10% or less is the icing. Well, that's actually how we need to think about rhetorical analysis. You're getting most of your score from the cake, from the thoughtful analysis. So you don't want to be spending a lot of time quoting. So if you're kind of checking a couple boxes here. If you're simply saying the author says blank, and you write a whole sentence or 2, you're honestly wasting time and space and energy, because you're going to take 1-2 minutes copying down that big old quote, and you're taking up precious time. If you take 1 or 2 minutes, well, now you're only down to 39 or 38 minutes, right? And that's just for one quote. So you can see these quotes, just copying down quotes, that time adds up pretty quickly. And here's the actual, like that's just a very concrete reason why this is helpful in terms of that time constraint. But here's the reality. Let's go back to number 1 now. Ensures you are the writer. I've taught multiple grades. I've taught grades 7 to 12. And so I see, like, in 7th, 8th, and even 9th grade, I often teach my students, like, find the best quote. Introduce the quote very clearly. But it's very rigid, right? For example, the author says blank, and I just rewrite the quote. Well, that's appropriate for freshmen in high school. That is not appropriate for freshmen in college. If we're still doing in our 11th and 12th grade year, or whatever year you are this year, what you did in 8th and 9th grade, have we advanced when it comes to embedding quotes as a writer? And I would say maybe not. So you're choosing the best quotes. That's super important. But then how are we actually going to write them? So I'll show you that here momentarily. But again, if I am copying down, let's say, John F. Kennedy's sentence, I'm giving him the floor. Now, clearly in rhetorical analysis, I am meant to give John F. Kennedy the floor. I'm analyzing his words, so I have to talk about what he says. But I don't have to give him the floor for more than a handful of words. I'm pointing out what he's saying, but I'm not just copying word for word much of what he's saying. So that's what you see today. You'll hear me say this a couple times. When you're quoting, less is more. It opens up space. If you're not copying down for 1 or 2 minutes at a time to quote, you have more time to analyze, more time in your body paragraphs to analyze, and it's making sure you are fully in control of the writing. One last note here, especially on number 2. I have seen papers that actually are really long, but if you take out all the quotes that are simply someone else's words, they're actually pretty shallow. So this is a way to make sure you are the one writing, you're the one earning the score. As readers, we see right through that. If you're just simply quote bombing, if you just quote, 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 it's very easy to see, okay, how much thought are you actually putting in? Where is your actual analysis? Sure, you've identified a great quote, but it's what you do with the quote that earns your score. That's the cake. All right, couple rules of embedding quotes that we're going to walk through. Rule number 1, only quote the author's most important words that exemplify the writing choice that you're analyzing. So if I have a 25-word quote, I might find the 5 words that actually prove my point the most, and I'll kind of paraphrase or go up to it, quote it, and then keep going. So I'll show you what that actually looks like practically. But again, in general, the shorter the quote, the better. Obviously, with the caveat, you're choosing what's worth quoting actually. You're choosing the words that make your point the most. Hey, if you can choose 5 words of the 25, clearly you're thinking at a high level. So here's an example of this. We've been talking about Ronald Reagan a lot, so I continue to stick with him as we're embedding quotes to start here. Reagan directly addresses the audience's emotions at the beginning of his speech, acknowledging that, quote, this is Reagan's words, today is a day for mourning and remembering. So let's see how many words I got. Today is a day for mourning and remembering. It's an 8-word quote. Clearly there's more in context here, but I'm just proving in a paragraph I'm quoting from Reagan, I am quoting the most important part to the quote. Now please remember, we've talked about this the last couple of weeks. It's what you do after the quote that earns your score. But this is for how to effectively embed the quote, include it in your essay. All right, this is not what I want you to do. Reagan directly addresses the audience's emotions at the beginning of his speech, saying, ladies and gentlemen, I plan to speak to you tonight to report on the State of the Union, but the events of earlier today have led me to change those plans. Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Now see, I actually quoted here a whole sentence because it's such a short sentence. But all of this other stuff, the sentence before it, the super long sentence, is valid here, absolutely. But it's not time well spent, and I'm giving too much of the floor to Reagan if I quote all of these words. So just getting to the core, out of that paragraph, these are the words that I want you quoting. What is actually his point? All right, rule number 2. Never start your sentence with the quote. All right, so I admit here in my parentheses, you can make this work like it's possible, but I recommend remaining in control of the writing by beginning each sentence with your own words. This is my rule. This is not College Board's rule. This is just advice. If you don't start with the quote, you're able to effectively build up to it more. So again, this is not a hard and fast rule by any means. Let's go back to my example previously. Reagan directly addresses the audience's emotions at the beginning of his speech, acknowledging that, quote. If I just said, today is a day for mourning and remembering, you could totally do that. Comma, Reagan says as he blah, blah, blah. But why I recommend rule 2 is because most students who start with a quote just end with a quote. And you definitely don't want to just throw a quote in there. You have to introduce it and explain it in context within the sentence. Now, my freshman would write, for example, Reagan says, comma, quote. For example, Reagan says, today is a day for mourning and remembering. Grammatically, that is a fine sentence. However, this sentence is obviously much more powerful in terms of putting the quote into context. So again, rule 2, don't start with the quote. Introduce it in your own words, or build up to the quote, I should say, in your own words. All right, let's look at a different example. Reagan then begins to address the families of the audience directly, telling them, we're thinking about you so very much. Again, look at how I'm putting the quote into context as I'm building up to it. Now, how many words did I quote? We're thinking about you so very much. 7 words. So out of the last 2 sentences, I've quoted 15 words. Less is more. Again, here's what you can do. We're thinking about you so very much, Reagan then says, as he addresses the families of the astronauts directly. And I'm actually recommending not to do it that way, but this sentence itself is not a problem. But so many students, if they don't focus on, that I've seen, if they don't focus on starting their own way, and short here. So the real problem is we're thinking Reagan says, and then ending, right? Or even worse, quote, we're thinking about you so very much, quote. Never have a sentence that's just a quote stand on its own. It's just not as effective writing. And let's be clear, you might read sample essays this year where that's the case. And they might even have gotten good scores. But that is not why they scored strongly. In fact, that is a lapse in writing style. So that's the College Board lingo. A lapse in prose. Prose is just writing. So a lapse in writing style. A big one for quotes is just quoting in isolation, right? Now, clearly the next sentence would still analyze it, but in terms of writing effectively, you want to do something like this. Reagan then began to address the families of the audience directly, telling them, we're thinking about you so very much. All right, here's our third rule for effectively embedding quotes. The function of the sentence with an embedded quote should put the words in context of the overall work. So you've seen me already kind of start to talk about that. Sandwiched between the phrase, we mourn, Reagan forces his audience to slow down and think of nothing but the astronauts, listing them by name. Notice how I said sandwiched between the phrase we mourn, and then I continue to go, I'm almost going to start analyzing here. Very quickly after this, I'll be able to unpack the reason why he uses the phrase we mourn, but not just why he uses those two words, but why he does it, where he does it. And that's where you're opening up doors to much higher levels of analysis, much higher levels of critical thinking. All right, note this. Let's go back to the most recent example that I showed you. Reagan then begins to address the families of the audience directly, telling them, we're thinking about you so very much. That's a great sentence. That's an effective way to embed a quote. But this one's even better. Because my quote is actually sandwiched between my own words, right? So I have my words, two words that are quoted, and then more of my words. Who's in control of the writer here, or of the writing here? Me or Ronald Reagan, right? Honestly, here, I'm in control, but I kind of let him control the ending. And that's okay, that's not a problem, but just hear me, more of this is going to be most effective. All right, not this. Because remember, rule 3 is put it into the context of the work. Reagan says we mourn multiple times throughout his speech. This is what most students use. I mean, this type of quoting, if they're embedding quotes effectively in terms of like the length and the way that they're quoting, a lot of students still do something like this, where you're just falling short of like the real analysis here. The real opportunities for analysis are not simply the words we mourn. It's actually like when and why he uses them, right? Think about it this way. I talked about a couple weeks back about what's worth writing about. And I said, hey, think about the audience and what would impact the audience the most. And then I said, if you see something happening repeatedly, it's probably worth analyzing. The author's doing that deliberately. Well, in Reagan's speech, he says we mourn multiple times. So this writer who says Reagan says we mourn multiple times has identified what's worth writing about, but by not placing it into the context of the work, we're only going to be able to get so far. Like I said, consider the implications of embedding effectively, especially with rule 3. We're talking about rhetorical analysis here. This is what might follow the quote that we just read. Reagan says we mourn multiple times throughout his speech. Here's what might follow. Reagan says we mourn multiple times throughout his speech. This would cause his audience to feel sad for the tragedy that occurred. By repeating we mourn, he wants his audience to know that the mourning process is not over. Okay, did I say anything wrong here? Absolutely not, right? This is all correct information. But I hope you're seeing there's more to it than this. And I typed this up because this is a representation of most students when it comes to rhetorical analysis. Here's something, I'll quote it, and I'll kind of talk about why the author uses it. But by not placing it into context, the door's kind of closed on where I can go, right? I can take a few steps forward, but I really can't go much further. Now, Let's look at what we could do with a more effective embedded quote. Same two words, but I'm putting it in better context with a sentence in which I'm embedding it. Sandwiched between the phrase "we mourn," Reagan forces his audience to slow down and think of nothing but the astronauts, listing them by name. Now that I have it in context, here's what would follow. Sandwiched between the phrase "we mourn," Reagan forces his audience to slow down and think of nothing but the astronauts, listing them by name. By doing this, Reagan is not only giving his audience permission to mourn, he is forcing them to do so, knowing that once they take time to mourn, they will be emotionally able to process the rest of the speech. So I'm putting this into context. I hope that just automatically you seeing my sentence here of analysis is much stronger than these two, right? This student writer is simply telling me, yes, there is emotion here. It is sad. This student writer here is telling me it is sad, but I also know why he's using it. He doesn't just want his audience to know that it's a sad thing. He's putting it in the context of the work. By Reagan doing or saying "we mourn" here, he's getting them ready to move on later. He knows what he's going to say later is controversial, and they're not ready to hear it until they actually take a little bit more process or part in the mourning process. I hope you see how this is more effective analysis, simply because I embedded my quote more effectively. I put it into the context of the work. Now, I did this last week. This is my model body paragraph, so we're not going to read it tonight. But again, I ended last week with this, kind of as a preview for tonight. Look at how many words are quoted in this model paragraph. Today is a day for mourning and remembering. We mourn. In this entire paragraph, I have 10 words quoted from Reagan. Who's in control of the writing here? Definitely the writer, not Reagan, right? Now, the bigger reason why this is important is this slide. I've highlighted in red not my wrap-up or my topic sentence, not the quotes from Reagan, but everything else that's actual my analysis. The more highlighting or red highlights I've got here, the stronger my score is going to be. So the real reason this is an effective paragraph, like the most important reason I should say, that this is an effective paragraph is because of what's in red. This honestly gives me time and space to do this. Not only that, but because I'm effectively embedding my quotes, what's in red is more effective. Let's go back to what I just talked about. Here, let's go back a couple slides. Here we go. This would cause his audience to feel sad for the tragedy that occurred. I would highlight that in red, right? That's my analysis. But my point being, not all analysis is created equal. So not only do I have a ton of analysis, I have a ton of effective analysis. My quotes help set me up for that effective analysis. What I would like to do now is take a few minutes. I retyped up some College Board released sample essays. So all of the previous slides was me typing, right? But here I just retyped what students actually did. So I'll give you the year and then the sample essay in case you want to look at it in context. So it's easy to find all of this online. These are great resources because maybe this is even more impressive or more important than what I've done. Because I took some time to think about, okay, what would a student actually do? What's helpful, etc. This student, or the students that follow, effectively embedded quotes within the confines of a 40-minute timed essay. Right? This is May of whatever year they're in. This is what they're going for to get their credit. So all essays that I pulled from today are a 7, 8, or a 9. And I'm not going to worry about which is which. Like they're all in the top tier of rhetorical analysis essays. The average rhetorical analysis essays most years is close to a 4.5. So that's like not college credit. That'd be tracking for a 2. If you get a 4, that's tracking for a 2 on that 1 through 5 scale, where a lot of colleges take 3s and 4s for college credit. Let's go ahead and look at my sample from 2018. Not my sample, a student sample. And these are out of context clearly, and we're not going to focus on analysis the rest of the way today. But please remember the 3 rules in mind, keeping them in mind. These students are doing this without going through this PowerPoint, right? But the 3 rules that they're doing it naturally. One, we are choosing the words that are most important, only quoting what's crucial, not an entire sentence at a time. Second, not starting with the quote, but introducing it in our own words. And I said, just like this quote here that on my slide right now, the best quotes often have my words, the author's words, and then more of my words, really being in control of the writing there. And then lastly, putting it into context. Sometimes you'll see that, sometimes not. But look at this sentence with me, and let's unpack this a little bit. This is a writer from 2018, just last year, just last May. The repetition of each has at the beginning of each phrase serves to emphasize the universal experience of adversity and obstacles. How many words are quoted? Let's start with that. So rule one, just 2 words have been quoted. That's great, right? Again, this student naturally is doing this without like having rules to prescribe to. Now, each has are the only 2 words that we're quoting, but the analysis is going to be opened up. Now it's repetition, so we know if it's something that's been happening over and over again, it's probably worth talking about. So this is a good job from this student of recognizing what's worth talking about here. Okay, rule 2, clearly doing what we talked about, not starting with the quote. And then let's look at it again. Let's look for, is this following rule 3? Is this placing it into context? The repetition of each has at the beginning of each phrase serves to emphasize the universal experience of adversity and obstacles. So when I say rule 3, it's not always going to say beginning, middle, and end. It's not always going to be chronological. You don't have to do it that way. I talked last week about I would do it that way personally. And it's an effective way of crafting an organizational pattern. But clearly, this quote does not just say the author repeats the phrase each has. The student is naturally talking about the purpose here. So the doors are going to be opened up of analysis, right? The doors of analysis are going to be opened up. Let's go to another one. This is from just the year prior, 2017. Again, out of context, we don't even know who the author is. It says she opens, but let's read this. She opens the speech with a paradox about being happy and challenged. First, she says she is flattered and honored, and then she says she is less happy than you might think. This is a great use of effective writing. Who's in control of the writing here? The student or who the student's quoting? I would argue the student is fully in control. Now look, there's actually 2 different quotes in the sentence. Flattered, and then at the end, less happy than you might think. 7 words total. But there's a lot of unpacking that's going to follow here in terms of the student's analysis. Again, that's not our focus today. Please know that that's what's going to follow. She's following, whoever the student is following rule 3. She opens the speech. I'm placing it into context. Because if I'm talking about it into context, again, that's opening up doors for higher level analysis. All right, let's look at another one. This is also from 2017. All right, so we know the author. Her name is Luce. Luce gives them a slight idea of the criticism that is to come by comparing herself to an arbitrary banquet speaker who shares the same difficult task. Let me fix that real quick for you guys. My bad on that one. Here's what we're looking at. 4 words of a quote. Again, notice this is a very high level writing technique. To quote, just a couple words, right? But to quote, put it more into your context, and then to quote again. We've seen that the last 2 times. Flattered, blah, 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 paraphrase, and then another quote. The more that you paraphrase in your embedded quotes, the more in control of writing you are. So clearly, this student, let's just go back right here real quick while I'm making this point. First, she says she is flattered and honored, and then she says she is. That and honored, and then she says she is. That's clearly a paraphrase to drive to the point. The words that are quoted are the most important words in terms of the point that she's making, the paradox, right? Here, the words that she's quoting, banquet speaker, difficult task, are the most important words to get her to prove her point. Whatever she's about to analyze, this student writer, that's where she needed to quote. So who shares the same difficult task. That phrase is a paraphrase that's just getting us quickly to the core of what she's writing about. So clearly she's still putting this into context. She gives a slight idea of the criticism that is to come. So she knows, like this student's really in control of this essay because she's about to talk about criticism of some sort in maybe a future body paragraph. She's putting it into context. But it's also very clear here what she's talking about, comparing herself to an arbitrary banquet speaker. All right, this is very effective student writing. This is actually the same writer. She had a lot of great stuff going on. So let's go ahead and look at it. Next, Luce employs some humor by saying that she is not the best candidate for the delicate art of giving the audience hell, but rather perhaps public figures like Billy Graham and Billy Sheen would succeed at it. Oh, I missed another quote here. Sorry, guys. Just so it's clear that what we're looking at. This one she did quote more, but it's still effective. And sometimes it is going to be more than 2-3 words. Delicate art of giving the audience hell. And then her second quote, Billy Graham and Billy Sheen succeed at it. Now, the first word of the sentence is next. So clearly we're still in context. And she says, Luce employs some humor by saying that she is not the best candidate. So the strategy is humor, but she's still putting it in context. Let's be honest, it's not as clearly put in context as the last couple, especially this one. I mean, this is the best example of Rule 3. But every time that she's embedding quotes, this student writer is doing it effectively. That's what I want us picking up on. Picking the most important words and being in control of the writing. Clearly, this student is going to be opening up doors to some high-level analysis. All right, this one is from 2015. Chavez, less than 10 words into his request, has already tied nonviolence to power. I love what the student did here. This is not even a phrase that's quoted, just 2 key words that Chavez used. This student goes on to really analyze and unpack why those 2 words were tied together. So really the strategy here is Chavez ties together nonviolence and power. Why this sentence is definitely up a notch in terms of a higher level sentence. I love that this student writer actually counted the words. Like, I'm not recommending that. I just think that was a cool thing that this writer did. Less than 10 words into his request. The point being, at the very beginning, he has already tied nonviolence to power. So clearly, this student is going to go on and say, this is why the author Chavez did this so early on, tying nonviolence to power. Now, most students would have said something like this. At the beginning of his essay, Chavez ties nonviolence to power. And maybe we wouldn't even quoted those words. But by quoting those words, yeah, you're citing the text, you're quoting it, but you're still making sure, yeah, I'm getting it from Chavez, those are his words, but I'm in control of the writing. This is checking all our boxes here today. Notice that I didn't create a rule for this, but we've seen several instances, in fact, the last 4, where there's a quote, student writing, quote. Here it's just quote to quote, nonviolence to power. This is also from that same essay. To further win the support of his readers, Chavez asserts that millions stand behind the cause of nonviolence, implying that nonviolence is more successful because it attracts people's support as opposed to demoralization. A 3-word quote, but it gets the job done. So I hope what you're hearing today very clearly is less is more. All of these quotes that I pulled, this is not just me coming up with what I care about, right? This is just the tenets of effective writing. I pulled these quotes from College Board's released essays, and notice they're all 7s, 8s, and 9s, and they're all doing things very similarly. Less is more when it comes to quoting. Who's in charge of the writing here? Chavez or the student writer? Clearly the student writer. If those quotes weren't there, and this is kind of a test, as you're practicing embedded quotes this year, if those quotes weren't there, would the sentence still sound like the student, or would they sound like Chavez? I'm going to say that again because this is how I want you checking yourself as you're practicing this skill. Does your sentence sound more like you as the writer or the person you're quoting? Let's read the sentence again. To further win the support of his readers, Chavez asserts that millions stand behind the cause of nonviolence, implying that nonviolence is more successful because it attracts people's support as opposed to demoralization. Clearly, this sounds like the writer. Let's go here. Who does this sound like, Chavez or the writer? Chavez, less than 10 words into his request, has already tied nonviolence to power. If you hear me say that out loud and don't see the text in front of you, you don't even know which words are being quoted. That's the true test of effective writing. Let's do one more. Let's actually go to this one. Does this sound like the student writer or Luce? Luce gives them a slight idea of the criticism that is to come by comparing herself to an arbitrary banquet speaker who shares the same difficult task. That is clearly the student writer who's in charge. Again, if you just hear me say that, the lines are blurred. You don't know when I'm quoting versus when I'm not. Go back to where my freshmen start the year, right? For example, Luce says blank. It's very clear that they're just citing Luce here. It's not clear here. And that's actually effective writing because this student is in control of the language, not just saying, I'm going to quote Luce here. That's actually all that I'm quoting tonight. I wanted to take the last few minutes here to talk about some practical punctuation realities. So there's a couple, I'll talk about two. There's a couple punctuation marks that as you become a more effective and better of quotes, you're going to want to know about. We didn't see them in our samples today, but the first is ellipses. The function of ellipses, and it's just 3 periods in a row, you've seen them if you don't know the word, ... The function is to indicate that you, as the writer, are cutting some non-essential words of the person you're quoting. But here's my caution when you use ellipses. The sentence still needs to flow. Again, the test is this. If you read the sentence out loud, does it still sound good? Like, does it still flow? Would the person you're reading it to even know you used an ellipsis? And if so, that's when you know you've done it effectively. Let's look at how this works. Thatcher reminds her audience that Reagan's policies won converts. If you hear that out loud, you do not know that I used an ellipsis. You don't even know that I embedded the quote, right? That sounds like me as the writer. I pulled this from another sample essay. Thatcher reminds her audience that Reagan's policies won converts. Now, here's what a lot of people do. A lot of students love the ellipses because they're like, okay, I'm going to get all of this down. I'm going to just show my reader that I'm quoting this whole big section. But don't do that. Don't write like this. Thatcher says policies converts. That does not make sense, right? So we know that you're quoting policies, blah, 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 whatever that sentence is. But it has to still sound fluent, right? Thatcher says policies converts does not sound fluent. A lot of students want to say, hey, in the first paragraph, Thatcher says blah, blah, blah. And what they want to do is say, when they're citing the paragraph, I've seen this so many times. The first word of the paragraph, ellipses, the last word of the paragraph. That is not effective at all. You can just say in the first paragraph and not quote it. I can go back and look at the first. So do not think that the ellipses are your friend if you're just trying to get more and more words on it. The skill is the same. The only 3 words that I'm quoting here in my do this statement, policies won converts. This is basically a substitute, this skill, for what these students are doing. So let's go back here. Nonviolence to power. If nonviolence and power are in the same sentence, and it flows with an ellipses instead of the word to there, that's what I would use. Let's find another one that's doing that. So let's go back to this one. First, she says she is flattered and honored. Well, what if flattered and honored was the quote, right? But it had a bunch of stuff in the middle. So what if it was flattered, and even though she wasn't happy to be there, she was honored? But my quote would be, first she says she is flattered, ... and honored, right? So the point being, the skills are the same. Only use ellipses when it sounds like the first sentence. Don't use ellipses if you expect me to actually go back as your reader and reread what's in the middle. That's not the point. Whatever you put on the page is what you're analyzing. And the last thing we'll do tonight, the second punctuation mark are brackets. You've probably seen them before. I just want to make sure that you know what they're used for, and if you choose to use them, you're doing so effectively. So the function of the brackets indicate that you are slightly modifying the author's words to fit into your sentence. So you are slightly modifying the words. My caution is do this sparingly. You don't have to do this often, but once in a while, it actually works, and I'll show you an example of that. Thatcher reminds her audience that Reagan invited enemies out of their fortress and turned them into friends. Now, you're making tiny, tiny tweaks here. So this might actually, out of context, this sentence might have been in the present tense. So Thatcher might have said, Reagan always was able to invite his enemies out of their fortress and turn them into his friends, or turn them into friends. But in my sentence, because I'm in control of the writing, I'm using it in past tense. Thatcher reminds her audience that Reagan invited is past tense, so I'm going to tweak turned into past tense. Totally fine to do that. Minor tweaks. But this is too many, so let's look at what not to do. Don't go overboard if this is a new skill that you want to start to practice. Do it very sparingly. So don't do this. Thatcher reminds her audience that Reagan invited his enemies out of their fortress and turned them into his friends. One bracket is certainly enough, right? Don't feel like this doesn't make your sentences stronger. You can do everything we talked about all day today, and just make sure you're following rules 1, 2, and 3, and you're fine. But if you wanted to do this, if you want to slightly change a tense or maybe a pronoun to fit your sentence, this is the way to do it effectively and correctly. So some reminders, just to wrap up for the night. Writing style is the icing on the cake, but don't worry about icing this year until you're building and baking a beautiful cake. That's all the analytical thought. Second, embedding quotes effectively can significantly improve your writing style. And 3 is kind of both. It's ticking multiple boxes here. Writing style, effective analysis. Embedding quotes gets us with both. That's why I wanted to spend our time here to end rhetorical analysis with this skill. Embedding quotes effectively opens up more room for analysis. All right, so stay connected. We are jumping into argumentation literally next week. So I hope that you all are ready for that. Last word here tonight is that if we're not going to be touching rhetorical analysis through 5able